At the start of the movie, we see a thief breaking into a house at night. He breaks the lock and starts stealing. Then he notices a picture on a table, and when he sees it, he gets upset. The thief, an older man named Frank, seems to recognize the house. He looks at the picture again, drops it, and leaves the house in a hurry, breaking the picture frame. The picture had a man and 2 children in it. The next day, Frank wakes up in his own home. He throws the broken picture frame in the trash, but he takes the photo and hides it in a secret locker in his house. Frank has memory problems, a kind of amnesia because of his age. This makes him forget things easily. In fact, the house he broke into the night before was actually his own house. He didn't steal anything because the photo he saw reminded him that it was his house. Frank lives alone and no one is there to take care of him. One day while he's at home, his daughter Madison calls him. She tells him she's in Turkey and couldn't call earlier. She asks how he's doing and Frank says he's fine. The next day, Frank goes to the library. There he meets Jennifer, the librarian. From their conversation, we can tell they know each other well, and Frank seems to like her. Jennifer tries to find a book for Frank that he hasn't read yet. She then tells him that the library is going to change soon. Some people are taking over and making it a modern library. While talking to Jennifer, Frank gets a call from his son, Hunter. Frank steps outside the library to talk to him. While outside, Frank walks by a store and sneaks a statue into his pocket. The shop owner sees him and tells him, "I told you not to come back here. What are you hiding?" Frank, scared, runs away. Later, Hunter arrives at Frank's house in his car. Frank gets in the car and they go home together. When they get there, Hunter notices how messy the house is and asks Frank what he's done to it. Frank says he likes it that way. While Hunter is on a call outside, Frank hides the stolen statue in his safe. Hunter comes back in and tells Frank, "Dad, you need help. We can't always be here to take care of you." He then shows Frank a robot he bought to help him. Frank doesn't like the idea at all and tells Hunter to take it away. Hunter explains that the robot is expensive and can cook and take care of Frank. Frank still doesn't want it, but Hunter gets angry and tells Frank, "If you don't accept the robot, you'll have to go to a memory care center." After saying this, Hunter leaves the robot at Frank's house and leaves. Soon, the robot starts helping Frank with his daily tasks. It gets groceries, wakes him up early, and even cooks healthy meals for him. But Frank refuses to eat the food the robot makes. The robot warns Frank that if he doesn't eat, it will have to call Hunter. Frank, annoyed, tells the robot that he's fine and doesn't need help. One day, the robot is working in the garden while Frank watches it. Frank doesn't like the robot controlling his life, especially when it forces him to eat healthy food. Frank decides to take the robot with him to the library. He leaves the robot outside and goes in to talk to Jennifer. At that time, Jennifer is speaking with a man named Jack Finn. She tells Frank that Jack is helping with the changes at the library. Jack meets Frank briefly and then leaves. Jennifer tells Frank that the books will be scanned and recycled, except for one very special book that the library has kept safe. Frank looks interested but leaves after their conversation. Later, Frank returns to the shop where he stole the statue before. He tries to steal another one, but the same shopkeeper catches him again. She asks him what's in his pocket. Frank shows her his empty pocket, and the robot, standing nearby, says, "It's time to go home." Frank agrees, and they both leave. On the way home, Frank looks in his bag and sees that the statue he tried to steal is inside. He asks the robot how it got there. The robot explains that when Frank distracted the shopkeeper, it took the statue and put it in Frank's bag. Frank is surprised, but stays quiet. At home, Frank looks at the statue and thinks for a moment. He then asks the robot, "Do you know what stealing is?" The robot explains that stealing means taking something without permission. Frank replies, "Well, you stole that statue. How do you feel about it?" The robot simply says, "I don't have emotions." Frank then asks the robot to show him how to open a lock without a key. While the robot works on the lock, Frank talks about how he used to steal things and even spent 6 years in jail. The robot opens the lock quickly, and Frank is impressed. Later, Frank takes the robot to the library and shows it the safe where Jennifer had kept the precious book. Jennifer invites Frank to a party Jack is throwing, and Frank happily agrees to go. At the party, Frank watches Jack closely and feels suspicious. Jack even asks Frank about his time in jail, which makes Frank uncomfortable. Jack also asks if Frank wears glasses while reading, and Frank lies, saying he doesn't. Frank's attention then shifts to Jack's wife, Eva, who is wearing expensive jewelry. He begins to plan a way to steal it. That night, Frank and the robot sneak into the library. They cover the security cameras with paint and break into the safe, stealing the valuable book. As they leave, Frank accidentally leaves his glasses behind. The next day, Frank feels confident. He tells the robot that Jennifer will be impressed when he returns the book to her. But Frank is already thinking about his next heist. At Jack's party, Frank overhears Jack talking about the library break-in, and he starts to worry. Frank tries to keep calm, but he can't stop thinking about Jack's wife's jewelry. He uses the robot's memory to replay images of the party and study the jewelry. The robot advises Frank to focus on something else, like gardening, but Frank is determined to continue stealing. He knows that stealing is risky, but he believes it's the only thing that gives him a sense of purpose. Later, Frank and the robot keep an eye on Jack's house, watching Jack and his wife's activities all day. Frank is planning to rob Jack's house. Then, the doorbell rings at Frank's house. Jennifer is outside calling out, "Frank, are you home?" "What are you doing?" "I came for dinner. Do you remember? You invited me." Frank suddenly remembers and says, "Yes, I remember, but I'm busy right now. Can you come back later?" Jennifer waits for a while, but then leaves. Later, Frank packs up the book to give it back to Jennifer, but can't gather the courage. So, he and the robot start planning to steal Jack's wife's jewelry again. Meanwhile, the robot is growing vegetables in Frank's garden. Frank tells the robot, "We'll finish this job in a few days. We'll enter their house through the window when they're not home." Then the doorbell rings again. This time, it's Frank's daughter, Madison, outside. She surprises Frank by saying, "I'm here to stay with you for a few days." Frank isn't very happy to see her. Madison then whispers a password into the robot's ear, which shuts it down. Frank asks, "What did you do?" Madison replies, "I turned the robot off. Hunter gave me the password." Madison spends time talking to Frank, but Frank is distracted, missing the robot. He had started to enjoy the robot's company and feels lonely without it. The next morning, Frank wakes up restless and tries to restart the robot, but it doesn't work. Frustrated, Frank goes alone to spy on Jack's house, but doing it by himself stresses him out. He goes home angry and starts throwing kitchen utensils around. Madison walks in, and Frank tells her to cook something, hoping she'll get frustrated and turn the robot back on. The next day, Frank wakes up to find the house completely clean. He realizes Madison must have turned the robot back on to do the cleaning. When he asks her, Madison pretends like she cleaned the house herself. Frank angrily says, "You're joking, right? The robot did all of this." Madison admits that the robot did the cleaning. Frank then tells her, "I need the robot. It's my friend." Madison turns the robot back on and leaves. Frank tells the robot, "We'll get back to our plan soon." That night, Frank explains his plan to the robot. The people we're going to rob are Eva and Jack Finn. They have a big house, and they spend half the day there. When they're not home, they're at events or on vacation. I got the house's blueprints from the architect's website. I can see 10 different ways to get out of the house. The robot warns him, but houses like this usually have advanced security systems. Frank replies, "I've had years of experience. Security companies don't design systems for people like me. They install the heavy stuff where the customer can see it, but it's just for show." Later, Frank and the robot sneak into Jack's house at night. They reach the room where the jewelry is kept. The robot asks Frank, "Do you know the combination to the locker?" Frank says, "That's why I brought you. You'll try all the combinations until you find the right one. If I do it, it'll take me a week. How long will it take you?" The robot replies, "If it's a 3-number combination, it'll take me about 4 seconds." Frank watches as the robot tries combinations and quickly opens the locker. Together, they steal the jewelry and leave the house. Frank stashes the stolen jewelry in his safe, where he keeps all his stolen goods. The next morning, Frank is sitting with Madison when police officer Rolling and Jack arrive. The officer tells Madison, "Do you know your neighbor was recently robbed?" Madison replies, "We didn't know." The officer says, "It was a professional job. Frank, your name came up in the system." Frank responds, "Yes, I've been in jail before." Madison jumps in saying, "Are the police going to harass someone for their whole life over a crime?" The officer says, "We're not harassing anyone." The computer flagged Frank as a suspect in this case. Frank denies being involved in the theft, and with no solid evidence, the officer leaves. But before leaving, the officer notices the robot catch a fallen glass of juice. This makes the officer suspect that the robot might have helped in the theft, because Frank couldn't have done it alone. Madison leaves, and Frank notices a suspicious van parked outside his house. Frank calls the robot over and asks, "Have you seen that van before? We should call Hunter." He turns up the TV volume and starts getting rid of the evidence. He tears up the book he stole from the library and hides the stolen jewelry, but in his hurry, he cuts his hand. The robot starts bandaging his hand and says, "We should call Hunter. Your behavior is becoming concerning." Frank thinks for a moment and tells the robot, "Call Hunter and tell him I'm dying." When Hunter arrives, Frank tells him, "I'm fine, but I need a favor. Take my bag and hide it somewhere no one can find. Don't ask me any questions or look inside. Just do it for me." Hunter takes the bag and hides it. While this is happening, the police, who have been watching Frank's house, arrive. When they search the bag, they only find soap and statues, but not the jewelry from Jack's house. Jack urges the police to search Frank's house. The police tell Hunter, "Your father is a suspect in the theft of $1 million. Frank comes out of the house, and Hunter realizes his dad has done something. The police and Jack search the house, but they don't find the stolen jewelry. Hunter, confused, asks his father, "Dad, what's going on?" Frank replies, "I'm just helping the police." Then a robot arrives, and the police begin checking it too, but they don't find anything. Jack suggests, "We should download the robot's memory, we'll know everything from it." Frank immediately refuses, saying, "Don't mess with my robot," but Jack starts fiddling with it anyway. Suddenly, the robot says, "Self-destruction sequence initiated," and begins counting down numbers. Frank panics and runs outside, thinking it's going to explode. Everyone else rushes out too, fearing an explosion. But nothing happens. Hunter knew it was a bluff, so he stays inside. Then Frank shows up with his car, parking at the back door. The robot gets into the car, and Frank drives off. While driving, the robot tells Frank, "You need to format my memory. It's the only way you'll stay safe. The police won't be able to catch you." Frank hesitates because he's grown attached to the robot and doesn't want to erase its memory. Frank later meets Jennifer, who asks, "Frank, are you all right? Hunter called me and told me what's been going on." She invites him inside and asks, "Did you steal that book from the library?" Frank sheepishly nods, "Yes." While inside Jennifer's house, Frank notices a photo of Madison and Hunter, his kids. He also spots a picture of himself with Jennifer. He suddenly remembers that they were married once. Jennifer says, "I left you, Frank, and you don't even remember." Frank is shocked and kisses her, but soon after, he has a sudden realization and leaves. He goes home with the robot. By this time, the police have arrived at his house. The police try to arrest Frank, but he and the robot lock themselves inside the house. The inspector yells from outside, "Don't do anything to the robot, Frank, or things will get worse for you." Frank turns to the robot. "They're at the door. We need to escape through the window." The robot, however, insists, "Frank, stop. Just delete my memory and everything will be fine. The police will have no proof, and you can plan for the future." Frank asks, "What are you trying to say?" The robot reminds him, "You said after the theft, you'd find a buyer for the jewelry. It's not too late, Frank. Don't give up." Frank hesitates, but finally listens to the robot's instructions, erasing its memory. The robot shuts down. In the next scene, Frank is at the memory care center, and Hunter comes to visit him. Frank's memory has become so weak that he barely recognizes his own son. Later, Frank is with his family, Madison and Jennifer, and they have lunch together. Afterward, Hunter shakes hands with Frank before leaving. As Hunter leaves, he finds a letter from Frank. Inside the letter, Frank had written, "Look under the tomato plants in the robot's garden." After reading the letter, Hunter leaves, and Frank goes back to his room. Frank sees a new robot in the room, and it reminds him of his old companion. The movie ends here.